Multicultural Counseling and Development. Nationally, Dr. West-Olatunji has initiated several clinical research projects that focus on culture-centered community collaborations designed to address issues rooted in systemic oppression, such as transgenerational trauma and traumatic stress. She has conducted commissioned research under the auspices of the National Science Foundation, ACA Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, Federal Witness Assistance Program, Spencer Foundation, the American Educational Research Association, and the African American Success Foundation. Her publications include 2 co-authored books, numerous book chapters, and over 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals. In addition to national presentations, Dr. West-Olatunji has delivered research papers in Eastern and Western Europe, the Pacific Rim, Africa, and the Americas. Additionally, she provided consultation in a PBS initiative to create a children's television show focusing on diversity through KCET-TV in Los Angeles, California, called Puzzle Place. Dr. West-Olatunji has also provided consultation to the Center for American Education in Singapore and to the Buraku Liberation Organization in Japan to enhance their early childhood and counseling initiatives. Additionally, she coordinated disaster mental health outreach projects in post-Katrina New Orleans, Southern Africa, and Haiti. Dr. West-Olatunji received her master's and doctoral degrees in counselor education from the University of New Orleans. It is my pleasure and honor to yield our floor to Dr. West-Olatunji.
Thank you so much. That was very nicely done. And I will say, very few people know how to pronounce Buraku for the Japanese people. So the Buraku Liberation League. So well done, well done. I'd like to start by giving you a little background. A lot of people talk to me about this work and wonder how I got started. So I do want to say I have been, interested, plagued by this work for a very long time. Many years ago, when I decided on a dissertation topic, I decided to do it on culture-centeredness training as racism-related post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in African-American adolescents. So a long time ago, I was wondering about chronic stress, about what was not a term at the time, traumatic stress, but I was trying to get there. So I was trying to find the words. And I remember looking for research about this, and I found one article, and it was in Public Health, and it was about bias and its impact on African Americans and our health. And so they were relating it to hypertension. And that was it. That's all there was, 20 years ago. But today, we can find a sufficient amount of research where we're constructing knowledge around this issue of traumatic stress and its relationship to our social positioning, to our positionality as culturally and socially marginalized people. And then after that, I had the opportunity to mentor students who were working on their independent studies, on theses, on dissertations, and I listed a few of them working on, and it really helped me to expand my conceptualization about traumatic stress and the issue of systemic oppression. And that really led me to an opportunity to create this Center for Traumatic Stress Research. For me, this is an opportunity to really coalesce my knowledge and also to serve as a beacon for other scholars, whether they're students or they're practitioners, they are other counselor educators, as well as people in the mental health areas who are engaged in knowledge construction, to come together and have discourse around what is known and what needs to be known. So my center has 3 focus areas, and the one that I'm really going to talk about today is related to social marginalization. And I really focus in on educational hegemony, what's happening to children in their schooling experiences, and then also community mental health issues around the disenfranchisement of many marginalized communities. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is these 6 topics. One, I'm going to talk a little bit and review, because I would imagine if you signed up for this webinar, you're already interested and have probably done some preliminary work in this area around the challenges of working with socially and culturally marginalized populations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who are those people in those populations and what are the challenges as we know it. So based upon the research that currently exists, what are the challenges for us as mental health service providers in being able to provide people with what it is that they need to self-actualize. I'm also going to provide you with a very focused or selected review of the literature of what is known. So what are we currently using, and what do I consider to be problematic about our current resources for working with this population, and provide you with an alternative. And I believe that that's traumatic stress, mostly because that's the work that I do, to be honest. So that's the solution that I see, and that's what I've been working on for the past 2 decades plus. And then I'll move to talking about some of the interventions, and I'll try to use those that have been proven to be effective, so they'll be evidence-based. And then I'll offer you some recommendations for what you could be doing either as an administrator, as a student, as a practitioner, as a counselor educator. And then I'll talk a little bit about clinical practice. And then I'll talk about what kind of research we could be doing. And I'll share with you some of my exciting research that I am doing now. So what are these challenges to work with culturally marginalized populations? So just to give you a sense, it's important to understand who am I talking about in terms of socially and culturally marginalized. So, you know, what I'm saying is that there is a dominant culture, there's a dominant social position to be in, and those people who are members of groups that are systematically excluded in significant ways. So in terms of the structures that are available, we think about marginalized communities. They often are disenfranchised because often resources for the community are not adequately being given and offered. In those, we have blighted housing. We often do not have, there's often trash often around. Often there are potholes around. So the services that are available in more privileged communities are not there. People are often renters rather than homeowners because for various reasons they are locked out of being able to become homeowners, whether it's the criteria for getting loans or it's because of people's backgrounds and lived experiences. But that's just one way in which we look at people being on the fringes and being systematically locked out of a lot of the privileges and rights that are being offered to other people. And this is often not only for a group of people in time, but often over generations. And so it becomes compounded. Culturally marginalized, we're often talking about people of color, talking about African Americans, Latinx populations, talking about Asian Americans, as well as indigenous peoples, First Nation people, indigenous people, Native Americans. Socially marginalized, we're often talking about gender issues, class, also people various sexual orientations, people who are of religious groups that are not dominant, and so on. So also ability issues. So we're talking about people who also are socially marginalized, but we're talking about not just the individual, but belonging to a group that is systematically locked out. So due to these not just decades, but often centuries of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and a lot of other forms of systemic oppression, clients from these groups have been poorly served or underserved. They often show a lack of trust in the mental health service delivery system. They still are prematurely terminating from therapy, often have minimal identification with the whole therapeutic process. And a lot of times we talk about that in a very othering fashion, to be able to say that certain groups of people don't believe in counseling. But I talk about it in terms of minimal identification, because if we look a little deeper, they definitely are interested in healing. They're just not interested in your branded counseling. So it's important for us to really understand that some aspects of the therapeutic process may be culturally embodied. And so we need to understand more about the varying cultural mores and worldviews when we talk about therapy or healing. And then finally, because of this socio-political context, people are often vulnerable to ethically weak practices. Now, what I'm saying there is that we haven't really talked about ethics in counseling as it relates to culturally and socially marginalized individuals, in the sense that we're not holding people accountable for adopting, for instance, culture-centered counseling theory. So this is maybe 30 years after we've had scholars, multicultural and culture-centered interventions. And that's very different from how we see it in our textbooks, where we are bending Eurocentric concepts to apply them. And so what I'm talking about is really starting with a different center for the values and the outcomes that we're seeking in terms of therapy. So what are some of these sociocultural factors, and what am I talking about in terms of oppression and psychological hegemony? So one is to understand that there's a lack of institutional resources and a lack of power to control those institutions. And that is really what we mean when we talk about this cycle of marginalization. And why is it systemic? And why is that such an important word when we talk about how people are being locked out? The second piece is that we as counselors and counselor educators have been slow to really talk about this. So I know you're thinking, okay, we're talking about social justice, social action, and didn't we even update our competencies to talk about that? What I see is that even though we're able to articulate this, we still don't have the skills, we don't have the actions, the behaviors. We don't have, it hasn't become second nature to integrate social action into what it is that we do. And again, I'm really going to say it's important for us to think about starting at a different center when we talk about therapy and we talk about our theoretical orientations. I'm not going to talk about that in this workshop, but I do a whole workshop on African-centered counseling theory, and there are many of them. These are the theories that I often include in the multicultural counseling course that I teach here at Xavier. But there are many, and I also make sure that students are accountable for knowing about Latino-centered, about Native American-centered, about Asian-centered theories. and also about interventions that they can use. So we're really slow to party. And so what I'd like to do in this webinar is to be able to bring out some of those concepts so that you can do further reading and hopefully begin the journey of becoming more relevant to your clients and in some way enhance their engagement in mental health. Finally, it's the realization that even right down to how we conceptualize the problems that our clients have is very hegemonic because they're still based upon Eurocentric, middle class, Eurocentric norms. And we need to think about, what are the norms for this particular population, and what product should we be moving toward for our clients to return them to their families, to return them to their communities, and they're still recognizable to their family and communities. So what we know from the last 10 to 20 years of research around traumatic stress is that it's very clear that systemic oppression has very strong negative physical and mental health effects on socially and culturally marginalized peoples. And so we have a good number of studies. It's wonderful to see that there are even dissertations that students are doing to contribute to this work. In public health and in the medical field, you won't see it termed as traumatic stress. It's often termed as chronic stress or pervasive trauma. And I talk about it when I'm, in communities and I'm talking to community members and families about this issue of systemic oppression and traumatic stress. I tell them it's like a slow drip. They get that. And so sometimes we miss it because it's not so obvious. It's not a big event that happens, but rather it's a series of microaggressions that we experience throughout the day, and then they accumulate, and we often have these responses to it. But I often talk about it as a slow drip. It's important to understand that this slow drip is often transgenerational. So it means that we are experiencing the trauma not only in our own lives, but also we're getting it from our parents and their parents and their parents through a lot of the ways in which we cope. So it becomes a way for us to deal with the environment that we're in. And it often is not something that is articulated. So it's been very implicitly brought to us. And a lot of it has to do with the historical nature of the oppression that we're experiencing. And it's so embedded in our society that it's been included in the very laws of this great nation. So it's important to understand that it's in the very fabric of our lives, and it impacts us not only on a daily basis. I would suggest that it's on a minute-to-minute basis. When I talk to educators, to often teachers, and I talk to them about working with children, particularly when they're in schools that are predominantly African American or Latino, for example, I tell them that oftentimes children will arrive at school already full of the microaggressions, and that they need to pay attention to that when they're working with these children and accurately incorporate much more of an environmental perspective, a more ecosystemic perspective on what's happening to these children. And then lastly, looking at the correlates between systemic oppression and traumatic stress, it is the idea that we're getting these additives. So what's happening is that we're having a cumulative effect in working across generations. So I hope that this is going to play. I'm going to do a portion of this video, 2 minutes, and hopefully it's going to play. Cross my fingers. Of course not. Of course not. Let me see if I can work on that. Let me see if I can work on that, because I really would like to show you this video, and you can hear some of these accounts of people who've lived through some of these horrific events that are part of our American or U.S. history, and that many people are still alive from these. Now, certainly if you take a look at some of the more recent events that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement, where you can see in real time in your, contemporary history. But for many people, that's a trigger for prior events that were even more horrific. So this one is about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the massacre of about 300 African Americans in this town. And in this video, there were some survivors who were talking about what it is that they experienced. So I'm going to see, when you're asking questions and answers, hopefully I can try to fix that and come back to it. So I talked a little bit about some of the physical and psychological effects of systemic oppression. And I mentioned to you way back in 1997, I was able to publish my dissertation, in which I found this one public health article about the idea that African Americans, that bias had been associated with issues around physical health. Today we know that also high blood pressure has been associated with systemic oppression and traumatic stress. We also know that depression, anxiety have been associated. And also, I know even my students, doctoral students, have engaged in research around traumatic stress and educational achievement, to be able to say that we can see some of those connections. When we think about what knowledge are we using today to look at traumatic stress and systemic oppression, we know that people are talking about trauma-informed interventions. There's been a lot of discussion about that. There's been some recent research on that. Almost any school that you go into that is called a high risk or has a large majority percentage of African American or Latino students, that you'll find some form of trauma-informed approach that is being used in that environment. And I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. Another is the use of psychotropic medications, but we also know that there are racial disparities in prescription patterns. So what that means is that many mental health professionals, psychiatrists in particular, may be disproportionately doling out prescriptions without looking deeper, without asking questions about trauma or traumatic stress, particularly to clients of color. We also know that there's a disproportionate use of psychiatric emergency services. So the idea that clients are not coming in, one, there's not prevention, so that's of course the important thing. And again, there's the disidentification with mental health. So we have some hurdles to get over, but that disidentification is based upon negative experiences that people have had. So there's a historic positioning toward mental health that is based upon how we've been treated. And so this results in the disproportionate of psychiatric emergencies when people could be treated before that. Anger management and behavior modification programs are also very prevalent when working with people of color and those who are socially and culturally marginalized. And one way in which we look at that is the overrepresentation of African American and Latino boys in disciplinary practices. So they are disproportionately receiving corporal punishment in schools. They're disproportionately getting expelled from schools. They're disproportionately being categorized as having behavior and emotional problems, disproportionately being selected for behavior modification and anger management programs. And so we see a lot of that. Finally, again, if we take a look at what are we currently doing, we are incarcerating people of color disproportionately. And I know many of you have already read those articles or become familiar with that research that talks about that. But I found an article that I think you might be interested in because it looks at this from an intersectionality perspective of looking at LGBTQ adolescents of color. And they are disproportionately represented in juvenile detention settings. They're more likely to have been incarcerated for over a year and are more likely to disclose experiencing sexual assault by other youth compared to their straight peers. So this is pretty much our go-to right now. And I'm suggesting that we need to rethink that. We need to think about doing something else, okay? So trauma-informed interventions, I found 3 really prevalent programs, and I do encourage you, if you know of any other programs, I'm very interested in that. So one is cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools, and that is being used and very popular. Another one is trust-based relational intervention that relies on relational cultural theory. And then the idea that trauma-informed schools where school personnel are trained in these trauma competencies, and the idea is to infuse it throughout the school. And they also with caregivers, with parents, and so on. So let's think about something else. So that's what we're doing. And I'd like to suggest that we could do something else. So when we think about traumatic stress, I don't know how much you already know about traumatic stress, but I really want to help you to see how different it is from our conventional view of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. So the idea is that trauma is about a one-time event in which a person feels physically threatened. And it doesn't mean that they were, but it's the perception and it matters. So it's a specific one-time incident in which an individual feels threatened. For PTSD, most important, direct personal experience. You're either witnessing or you are the victim. We often talk about hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction, and so on. We talk about trauma. There's a list, a lot of different kinds of trauma that are out there. And as you can see, what I've been sort of hinting at up until now isn't really included in this. So that means that when we experience traumatic stress and we experience one of these, it is on top of that daily slow drip, drip, drip of traumatic stress. And so it is by nature complex. So traumatic stress and systemic oppression has to do with this idea that your social positioning has a lot to do with where you were before the experience of trauma occurred. When we talk about traumatic stress, it's sort of happening as. So those things are being integrated and woven from the time that you were born, perhaps even in, there's a study for you, right? So for some groups of people, poor people, the elderly, those who are culturally diverse or culturally marginalized, those who have varying abilities are disproportionately affected by traumatic events and experiences based upon where they fit and what their historical experiences have been. So this idea of traumatic stress theory is really incorporating what we know as counselors to be core in providing effective counseling. And that is, we need to incorporate an ecosystemic perspective. We need to consider contextual factors when we're working with our clients, that there is no way that we can be effective without incorporating this environmental scan in thinking about our clients, particularly those who are from culturally and socially marginalized groups. And again, this idea of traumatic stress is about the slow drip of oppression, like a leaky faucet. So this research that has been advancing over the past 10 to 20 years, really focusing on this idea of historical trauma or generational trauma, and the idea that the oppression that is experienced is we talk about institutional, but I like systemic, because it really speaks to the idea that it's like a fabric of the closure where it is woven like a cloak throughout society. And the idea that even though it's a slow drip, the reaction that one can have can still be negative, sudden, and uncontrollable. So when we think about academic success, I mentioned that at least 2 of my former doctoral students took a look at traumatic stress and academic achievement, as I did many years ago. And what we understand is that hyperactivity, aggression, difficulty concentrating, sadness, association, and interpersonal conflict. So take a look at those. Those are many of the characteristics of these students who are being shuffled off to behavior modification programs. Students who are experiencing over-diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we really do need to think about this as an alternative to, I think, marginalizing these students. So we need to better conceptualize the issues, and because we are misconceptualizing perhaps these students. In early childhood, it can look as inconsolable crying, disorientation, diminished interests, aggression, withdrawal, and definitely a change in normal activities. So what does this look like when we think about looking over generations? The idea is that there's an absence of direct exposure, and that's a key piece I want you to remember. When we think about intergenerational, transgenerational trauma, the difference between traumatic stress across generations and our conventional view of trauma is that there's an absence of exposure. A lot of this work started with understanding of Jewish Holocaust survivors and looking at their children, people wondering, why do their children have trauma symptoms, even though they had no exposure to it. We also have done studies looking at World War II veterans. We also have some really good research that's happening with Native Americans, and they're offering that with you tonight. And I've talked a little bit about some of those. I didn't talk about suicidal ideation or substance abuse, and definitely the idea of this aggression be part of interpersonal violence. So again, the idea of when we see these symptoms, do we see them as secondary symptoms or primary symptoms? Here's another great video that it looks like I need to try to pull up while you're asking questions, because it's talking about Native Americans and historical trauma. And I really want you to get a chance to see that. Again, this one is only about 2 minutes. So I'll do some problem solving and find out what that. So again, this is looking at the DSM and how the DSM isn't really addressing this. And so it's very difficult for us to be able to use this in terms of diagnosis or even just getting a sense of what's going on, because we often don't know where the assessment tools are. We haven't been educated on traumatic stress, and we certainly are not expected to do the environmental scan that's necessary. So one of the things that's found is a great scholar who's a Native American scholar, and he has provided us with this idea of traumatic stress intervention that is around a discussion. It's called healing discourse. And it goes in 4 steps. First, there's an articulation of the emotional burden. And it's really being able to give name to what it is that we're experiencing, because so often we experience it individually, and we think often that there's something wrong with us, and we internalize what it is that we're experiencing. By having group discussion about it, it allows us to understand that it's happening to many of us, and that it makes our lives very chaotic and unmanageable. And a lot of that is because the rules don't often apply to us. And so it becomes very difficult. There's a great quote, I'm trying to think, I'll think of it. It's a quote that refers to, let me think of it. There's a great writer, and she said that she got arrested one day because she was walking down the street, and she crossed the street on the red light. And when the police officer came and asked her why'd she jaywalk, she said, well, I saw all the white people crossing on the green light, so I figured the red light was for me. And so this is the idea of the chaos that's created in the environment when there are a set of rules, but we understand that there are implicit differing rules for us, and it becomes very complex. And this is something that we experience from as children to adults. The second step in this healing discourse is the cathartic disclosure, in which we talk about our past ordeals. And so there is a mutual sharing, and there is a testifying, if you will, of what's going on. And then self as project reflexivity, and what that means is a daily self-assessment. So if we understand what's going on and we are able to admit that we are living in a world that is created in contrast with our values and in many ways is oppressive. And then we talk about and are aware of the ways in which we experience microaggressions, and we've been able to talk about that, then as human beings in a very humanistic way, we also need to understand how we need to reclaim our humanity. And so we need to figure out how do we do that, and that's a lifelong project of introspection and reflexivity. It's seeing oneself as a therapeutic project, a lifelong therapeutic project. And finally, it's the idea of the impact of colonization, and that is really a life to understand that we are racism and cultural hegemony, and that is a way to arm ourselves against the oppression that we experience on a daily basis. So if I'm saying that because of microaggressions and without the opportunity to reflect on those things and sort of empty your cup, we fill up with those things. If we don't empty our cup, we wake up full. We wake up responding and reacting to the oppression that we deal with on a daily basis. So within Gon's perspective, there are these 4 goals for therapy. That means that as counselor, your job is to assist your client in highlighting the systemic factors along with the interpersonal. It means that we are not saying that people don't have character flaws. We're not saying that people aren't interrupting themselves, that they are not contributing to this. What we're saying is that those two things go hand in hand, that we need to understand the systemic factors as well as the interpersonal factors in order for us to understand how are we responding, what do we need to do differently. So in the context of, for instance, African American in this example, the idea is moving toward wellness where there is a strong identification with one's identity. So in terms of Native Americans, it is with Indigenous identification. And thinking about Latinos, it's a Latinx identification. It's about cultural reclamation, spiritual well-being, and the idea that we're focusing on wellness. We also, something that counselors don't do as much as we should, and that is process and mental health outcome evaluation. So how do we incorporate that in this liberatory form of counseling that we're talking about? Because often culturally marginalized folks incorporate spirituality into their understanding of healing or of therapy. And so how do we incorporate that into how we evaluate both how we're engaging with our clients and also whether or not we've helped them to achieve their goals? Final is that individuals are embedded in families and communities. And so there is this idea that community emancipation is a goal. And so now we're really getting to this idea of social justice, social action as being incorporated in how we look at counseling and how we look at what it is that we do. Some other interventions that have been shown to be effective in dealing with traumatic stress is, again, this idea of self-reflection. So the idea of journaling in some kind of way, some way to document and access our thoughts and to be able to review how we're engaging in this hegemonic environment that we're in. The idea of using the group so that there's some synergy, there's some normalizing that goes on. The idea of talking about, the oppression, educating people about the role of identity development and ways in which people are experiencing psychological hegemony, cultural hegemony. The idea of testifying, there's been lots of research talking about how people of color use testifying or testimonials to be able to bear witness to their experiences. The idea of mindfulness, I often remind people, certainly from the African American experience, I know that my elders and maybe their parents used to have a service called the moaning bench, and they would be in these rural churches and the entire service would be moaning. I mean, can you imagine the opportunity to emote and to be able to share with a group of people about the deep, deep well of resources and resilience that people have of coming together. The use of creative arts therapy, dance therapy is a big one, but also we have people engaging in very revolutionary forms of, use of theater, people using, photography, drawing, and so on, and definitely storytelling, or the use of cuentos. I do want to just accentuate the idea of resilience as being important, because we don't want to problematize a community We do not want to do that, because one of the things that we know is that the people are still here. So regardless of the kinds of oppression in which it looks like the dominant culture is trying to eliminate people by massacring them on so many different occasions, and yet we see people bouncing back. We see them here. We see them in our programs. We see them coming to us for counseling. We see them in so many different places and spaces. So despite the adversity, despite the risk, people still show up. I remember I had a client who was a high school student, and you know, he used to talk to me about what it took for him to get to school. He lived in a very high crime community, low resourced, and he basically went through an obstacle course to get to school. And his mother went to work before, you know, earlier in the morning before he went to school, so he had to get himself to school. And he could have not gone to school. He could have just hung out, played hooky. But instead he went to school. He fed himself, whatever he could, and he got himself to school. But I had a chance to go to his school. And his teachers, they were very rude and disrespectful, not only to him, but to the other children. And I thought, that teacher doesn't know what that child has gone through to get to school. That in fact, I see that child as being very motivated to be at school rather than a student who's not engaged, not interested. So we really do need to think of our clients in a very strength-based perspective and think about how resilient they are in the ways in which they're coping with adversity. So what do I recommend? For policy, I say CACREP needs to include accountability for knowledge of traumatic stress theory. It needs to be in the requirements that programs need to cover. So there needs to be an understanding of what's real, what people are really dealing with, to make this knowledge more widespread. So not only incorporating it in terms of thinking about clinical knowledge, but also clinical skills. So we need to know more about this. I think that counseling program department chairs should develop training opportunities that help students to become exposed to members of socially and culturally marginalized communities that are in proximity of the university campuses. And this is true. It doesn't have to be, a lot of people might say in the heartland, there aren't a lot of people of color. But I've been in the heartland and there are people who are socially marginalized. So it doesn't have to be culturally marginalized, it could be socially marginalized. And to look at how those folks have been marginalized from the mainstream and what have been the outcomes, and to get an opportunity to talk with those folks and think about what can we do, what kind of service learning activity can we develop to respond to the needs of that community. And then also I believe that our professional organizations, whether it's ACA or it's any of the divisions, it's state branches, that we need to consider the ethical codes to think about how can we hold people more responsible for understanding traumatic stress and systemic oppression, and what it is that we need to be doing differently in working with culturally and socially marginalized clients. For practice, one is, of course, need to increase knowledge. So if you attended this webinar, you're already on the way. It's like you started, that's good. But we also need to think about what are our biases in terms of case conceptualization. A lot of times, like I said, we are missing an understanding. That same young man that I talked about, who had the obstacles to get to school, I remember when I first started working with him, I had no idea what he was dealing with. And I remember we were we were in a program and I was walking from one building to another with him. I looked up and I saw the full moon. And from my living experience, I'm thinking, oh, how romantic, full moon, So I'm getting really dreamy. And he looked at me and he said, in my community, when it's a full moon, people get really crazy and there's a lot more shooting. So it's a little scary to me. And I thought, yeah, I need to check myself on my biases about the meaning making for anything. And I shouldn't take anything for granted. And I need to remember that I need to check with my clients to find out how do they view things and not just assume that my beliefs are universal. I think that we need to increase our clinical skills when we're working with clients who've experienced traumatic stress. We need to know how to assess them properly. We need to know what interventions we need to use that are specifically focusing on their traumatic stress and historical trauma. We need to use culture-centered theories and interventions when working with culturally diverse clients. And we definitely need to work on our advocacy skills because we're talking about systemic forces and how these forces impact our clients. I often say to my students, when we think about advocacy skills, I give them an example that hopefully helps them to think about what they need to do differently. So I say, if you're walking down the street and you saw a person, they were laying down and a branch was over them and the branch was too large for them to pick up on their own. What would you do? Would you lean over and say, tell me how that feels? And they look at me and they laugh. Of course not. And I say, but we often do that. We look at this outside force that is impacting our clients, and yet we solely want to deal with the intrapsychic. So I'm saying, what do you need to do? And they say, well, first I need to get the branch off the person. And that's also true for the clinical work that we do. We need to metaphorically, get the branch off people. That means we need to be able to address the systemic forces that are impacting our clients and also work with their intrapsychic issues. As researchers, we need to engage in liberatory research practices. And I wrote a whole article on that. It's in JCD and talking about emancipatory research. And so we need to think about, if we get off this page of Eurocentrism, what values are at the center of our practices? So we need to think about that. We need to think about engaging in research that contributes to real changes in the lives of real people. That takes more work, that's true. It may be more time-consuming, labor-intensive, but I think we could sleep at night, and I think that's what matters. That means that we also need to advocate for different ways in which we're evaluated, because I can imagine a counselor educator is already saying, yeah, but I can't get tenure off of that. I understand that, I hear that. But that's the role of senior scholars, to be able to challenge higher education, to think about more inclusive ways to define research and scholarship, because we do need to be responsible, and we are humanistic, and so we need to think about different kinds of research in which we engage. We need to design studies that are traumatic stress related, about historical trauma. And we definitely need more diagnostic instruments. Right now we have one that's really good. It's called the Historical Losses Scale. And it relates to historical trauma, and it's been norm referenced on Native American populations. So I think that is it. I've given you some references for you to get started, but I have a few bibliographies that I could share if people are interested, that are on historical trauma, on traumatic stress. So you can do more of that. But that is it. I'd like to open it up for some questions and answers. I'm actually going to stop the sharing and see if I can get those videos to work while there. So, and then you can see me. So while you're talking to me, I will be trying to get.
So thank you so much, Dr. West-Olatunji. We have lots of questions pouring in. I am excited because we have some passionate doctoral students and members of the 2020 Wellness Task Force, and I want to open the floor so we can hear their voices. We're going to start with Brianna, and if you want to take the floor and unmute your mic, she has 2 questions for you.
Yes, good evening. Thank you so much for your work. I'm so excited. So I do have 2 questions. So my first question is, have you seen master's doctoral level counseling programs that actually integrate healing discourse as part of helping skills or theories courses? And my second question is, what's been your experience of integrating culturally centered theories and interventions into training of counselors? Was there any backlash? Was there a lot of support? So I guess you can answer both of them. They kind of are related.
Yeah, so healing discourse. I have not seen any programs that have healing discourse as part of the curriculum. I've not seen it on anybody's syllabus or anything like, so I haven't seen that. But there are opportunities for students to go into communities where healing discourse is occurring. And it's happening in a lot of different ways in different communities. So there are quite a few scholars. So one is the Association of Black Psychologists have a whole curriculum, and they also do paraprofessional training in various cities. So you could actually learn how to facilitate a group where you're dealing with historical trauma. And of course, the example that I provided is Native Americans, and you certainly are gone and ask, where are some of the healing discourse programs going on, and ask if you could come and be a part of those. But the first step is to really start reading and becoming knowledgeable about a social action that you can take is to ask that question in your program, to ask, is there any way in which that can be incorporated so that there's some understanding? And if they say, well, I don't know anything about that, you can say, oh, well, I know a scholar. Is there any way that we could Skype this person in to our class as a guest lecturer so that everybody can benefit from knowing this? Now, that moves into the second question, and that is, I've had the opportunity at Xavier, which is a historically Black college, university, but also I taught for about a decade at the University of Florida, and I also taught at the University of Cincinnati. And I could say pretty confidently, you will know my students when you hear them, because these students who were predominantly white, middle class, master's and doctoral students are some amazing scholars who espouse emancipatory research and emancipatory clinical practice. So it can be done. It can be done. And I would say that students are hungry for it because it makes sense. And I think the most important thing is, so here's another story. I'm full of stories, I should say. I love stories. So here's a story. So, I believe in this. So what was it, 2007? I took 27 people from ACA, with faculty and students, and we went to Southern Africa. We went to Botswana, and we went to South Africa. We were in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And I remember us being in Soweto, which is a suburb of Johannesburg. And we were sitting in an agency and we were talking and everything. And then they got really excited and they said, well, actually, there's another program, and it's off the grid. It's just like a community thing, and we can take you to it. So we're like, hey, okay. So it's walking. So all of us, so all these white people, and then the local folks, the clinicians, everything, we walk through this whole neighborhood, and we go and we find this little storefront kind of thing. And they're just in there working with that community, doing amazing things. So it was great. We had a good time. We're walking back, and I'm walking with one of the students. And he turns to me and he says, you know, I just realized I've never really gone across town in our town, right? Where the school is, where the university is. And I just silently said to myself, yes, 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 yes. So it's like, so that's it. It's like, you get it, but you have to go all the way across the ocean to figure out that you could be serving that community that's like 2 miles away that has the same need. But if I said that in class, there might have been resistance. But going and experiencing that and recognizing that these are just people, they're interested, you're engaged in the interaction, and there's benefit. So not only does our competence increase because we're able to conceptualize better about what's going on in their lives, but we also see that we can make a difference. So there's a lot of motivation for us getting off campus and getting out there. It also increases our ability to engage in research. So our ability to investigate, to get to some greater truth is increased by our ability to engage in discourse with the people who are being served. So your last little piece, the mini question, has there been a backlash? Well, you know, anytime you're doing something good, there's always going to be backlash. But I always say higher education is so dysfunctional. If there are 6 people who are against what we're doing, there's another 6 people who don't like those 6 people, and they're going to support you no matter what. So always do your best, and it'll all work out in the end, because if people don't like you, those other people will. So just do your best, and it'll be appreciated by somebody.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want me to just look at Dr. Hughes?
Yes, I am sorry. I was having a little trouble getting off mute. Brianna actually had 2 questions originally, so she's kind of backing away from the second question, it seems. And there are others on the line who are anxious to ask questions too, Dr. West-Olatunji. David Thomas, who is a part of our Wellness Task Force with African American Concerns, so happy he's here tonight, has a question to ask.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. My first question is, I work with youth or at-risk youth between the ages of, say, 10 years old and maybe 15 years old. And some of the interventions that you talked about, are they just as impactful for children as they are for adults? And my second question is, what is the best approach for children when we know that after that counseling session, you're placing them back in a family that's in distress?
Yeah, so these are not only, I would say, not only for children, we've also used them with young children. So I actually specialize in working with children from 0 to 5, and we actually use these techniques with them as well. So it's for and the earlier the better, actually, because then you're not doing so much remediation, you're actually building and giving them the tools that they need for the future, and they can rely on those as they go through the various developmental stages. They have the resources. That is the biggest thing that in working with children, and I talk to parents, caregivers about this, is that we need to give them the tools to be able to deal with the with the microaggressions, the ability to deal with the systemic oppression. Not talking to children about the reality of the hegemony is leaving them defenseless on the battlefield. Arm your children. And this is not just me. The research supports it. When you tell children that this society is operating in contrast to who you are, it arms them because they're experiencing it, but they don't have the words to talk about it. And oftentimes they'll think that the problem is them. I hear children all the time talking about, I'm weird, I'm strange. I'm like, no, you're not. The world is weird. You're fine, okay? So they're gonna make whatever sense they can of what it is. So it's best for us to be able to educate them. But this is supported by empirical research. We've seen it in looking at the difference between parents who educate their children. They do what's known as race knowledge. They talk to their children and they talk to them and say, hey, you're smart, you're able, da da da. This is what your people can do, blah, 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 blah. Those folks out there, they're not interested in you. They're not trying to help you. Don't look to them. They're not trying to do that. You just go on and do what you have to do. Studies have shown those kids do better than when parents don't tell them anything. So parents need to know that. Arm your children so that they know what's going on and they know that's not them. I've done that with a kindergarten class. So a kindergarten teacher came to me for consultation and she said, school was like 98% African American. And she said, my kids, they're great in my classroom, but when they get outside my classroom, like to go to lunch or recess or whatever, they keep getting into trouble. So we're back to this issue of how do we handle what we see in terms of our children and their behaviors? And often it goes straight to behavior modification, goes straight to these issues around discipline, never taking in the environmental. So I said to her, okay, tell me a little bit about how you teach. So when she was telling me, she was using a lot of culturally informed teaching practices. So what was happening is something very good. You got the kids coming from home, they get that. They're going to school, they get that. So now it's like, ooh, that's good. We have congruence between school and home. But when they went outside our classroom, it was different. The rules are different. But they didn't know. So they keep bumping up against that and they get these disciplinary referrals. So I said to her, tell them there's a difference. Tell them that the expectations for them are different. Okay? So I said, tell them, you know, whatever way you want to do it. I gave her the example of AM and FM. So everybody's like, you like AM or you like FM? It's like, this was a while ago. Nobody listens to the radio anymore. But it's like, old days, they were like, no, we jamming on FM. We jamming on FM. What's AM? They're like, ooh, old people stuff. We don't listen to that. So I say, okay, when we're in the classroom, these are 5-year-olds. I said, when you're in the classroom, ooh, it's FM. All right, you know, it's jamming. We get this. This is affirming. I know the rules. When you get outside, it's AM. So they tell you have to stand up straight, no talking, walk in a line. That's AM. That's what you do out there. But when you get back in here, FM, all right, okay. So that's telling them that it's two different worlds, two different expectations. For almost all, you know, there's always a kid who's like, no matter what, they just gonna do it. But the majority of the kids, her behavior problems cleared up. And it's because they understood. So this idea of being able to educate children about what's happening to them is very important. Okay? It arms them and it allows them to have agency so that they choose. They choose when they want to throw down. They choose when they want to confront it. They choose or they decide, okay, I got a different goal. It's like, I don't need to do that right now. I'm gonna just let the crazy people go. I'm focused on something else. So I choose my battles in the system. So you can educate children about that, about what it is, and you can do it developmentally at different levels until they get to be, you know, about middle school, about 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, when you can really start doing identity development and talking to them about who they are and so on. And then you can really begin to talk about, the history and things like that, so that they can begin to understand even better about what it is that they're dealing with. But what we do know, right, from the literature is that one, ethnic identification is correlative to academic achievement. What we do know is that parents telling children about there being this cultural hegemony, and that has a lot to do with how they're treated and how they might be marginalized or looked over, also is correlative to higher academic achievement than with kids who don't know what's going on. So yes, you can think about ways in which you want to tell that story at a developmentally appropriate level to help children to have agency in order to self-actualize.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Dr. Arliza Marai.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful teaching. It's very powerful. I wanted to know, have you heard of the term continuous traumatic stress? And if you have, what do you think about it versus post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things about that. I've not heard specifically the term continuous traumatic stress. And at the risk of sounding not very scholarly, I'm going to guess at what it is. It is that slow drip that I was talking about. It is this idea that it doesn't end. There is no post to the traumatic stress disorder. There's no post. And I can tell you, living in New Orleans, we talk about, Hurricane Katrina. That was now, how long? 2005. So it's 13 years ago. We are still not at PTSD. We are still in traumatic stress. There is no post as yet. So continuous traumatic stress is the slow drip, and I'll say related to systemic oppression, is the slow drip of oppression. It is the daily microaggressions. It's the minute-by-minute microaggressions that impact us. And I often say to adults, not so much to children, I don't tell them that, but I tell adults about children, but I also talk to adults about us. I know that there are times when in the day, I find myself anxious. I didn't even have coffee. I'm anxious. And I have to ask myself, why am I anxious? And then I can sit down and think about events that have occurred, like my day, little small microaggressions, but it's impacting me. They are just piling up one on top of another. So that's why this idea of reflection, so you even see it in Gon's work, the healing groups, that the idea of doing the self-reflection is important. It's like emptying a cup. So if every day that we experience this continuous traumatic stress from these microaggressions by being marginalized in all these tiny little ways, and sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're aware and we just think, let it go. Somebody does something so slight and you just say, let it go. But the problem is there's so many of those in a day, and it's like it fills up a cup. So self-reflection is emptying the cup. You gotta empty that cup. If not, it's gonna spill over. And it spills over in our interpersonal relationships. It spills over in our lack of ability to focus and make good decisions, right? It spills over in us not achieving our goals. When we say we're supposed to be doing something, like, oh, I'm not gonna do that, I'm tired. It's like, but it's exhausting. All the stuff that's attacking us, so I would guess, but I'm gonna Google it. I'm gonna Google it to be sure what that is. And you can be sure that the next time I talk about this, I will include continuous traumatic stress in it. So thank you very much for mentioning that.
You're welcome. And that was actually the correct definition. Thank you.
Thank you.
power of a good context clue. The next question I'm going to share from Rebecca H. She doesn't have a microphone, and she's wanting suggestions of ways that you can engage with adult clients in short-term crisis stabilization. And that's her question.
Yeah, so it depends upon what that crisis is. So if it's interpersonal, the first thing, of course, is always safety. And so the idea is to remove yourself from any kind of harm whatsoever. But in general, if we're talking about trauma, is that I always say the first thing is that we need to have some normalization. So I often tell people, it's almost, it becomes very regimented, and that's very helpful to people. So I often tell people to live life. So the idea is that regiment your life, avoid chaos, lots of people, like avoid Thanksgiving with a lot, but the idea is to avoid chaos, and also to find ways to engage in mindfulness. Now, mindfulness I talk about in a broad context because mindfulness has been co-opted in a commercial kind of way so that people almost purchase mindfulness in that sense. And I mentioned earlier about, where in the African-American tradition, there is the idea of having the moaning bench, of having a service where people just emote because there's been such a deep loss, or there's been there are no words for what it is that is being, and so that's what they call reaching into the deep well in order to be able to do that. So this idea of mindfulness is in a broad context. It could be praying if that's what people do, and it's doing it in a very, and it's an opportunity to go deeply into that. It might be for them to be able to meditate, and that might be helpful. But the idea is that mindfulness exists in a lot of different cultural contexts. And so it's important to honor where people are coming from. And we try as much as we can not to have people to borrow from other things, but we ask them what are forms of mindfulness in their own culture and allow them to talk about that. Also, another thing in terms of short-term crisis stabilization, I always, again, thinking culturally, I always ask people, what have your people, whether it's family or community or your cultural group, what have people done when they've experienced such a loss or such a crisis in the past? Because I want people to access their cultures within their own context. And that becomes very, very important. Sometimes people are disconnected from their group. And so that becomes part of the crisis stabilization, is to help them to have some form of support while they're going. And even in that, you ask, what are the forms of support that are available within that group? So short-term crisis stabilization has to do with regimenting their lives, meaning you go to bed at the same time. You form a ritual for going to sleep of turning out the light, listening to the music, or whatever. And you do that about eliminating a lot of noise in one's life that further agitates people, but rather to have peacefulness and calm in their lives. I mentioned, of course, eliminating any risk or harm so that people have some sense of safety in order to do that. I would say that those things, but doing them within one's own context become very important to do. Did that help you, Rebecca?
So Rebecca doesn't have a microphone, so I'm going to say that it was well answered, Dr. West-Olatunji, and she is in the chat.
Okay.
Wait a minute, she said yes, thank you in the chat room. So yes, it did answer her question.
Awesome.
And we're going to go for one last question. And that question is from Kalisha.
Hi, Dr. West-Olatunji.
Hi, Kalisha.
I wanted to know if it was, we were having a good conversation about historical trauma and systemic oppression. I wanted to know about your opinion on, is it better to do cross-sectional research or longitudinal on the effects of historical trauma and systemic oppression?
Both are needed. Absolutely. I don't think that I would say one over the other. The cross-sectional is really good. Are you thinking in terms of the demographics within a group? So for instance, if you, yeah, absolutely. I think that's very important. You've heard questions tonight asking about children, for example. So if you were looking at different age groups within the population, that's important to take a look at to see how they're responding, what their thoughts are about it, what their self-awareness, what is their knowledge about systemic oppression. That would be very important to look at gender, for example, to look at SES within the group. That's something we haven't talked about tonight at all. But one of the things that we know is that in the case of historical trauma, that SES has not been a buffer whatsoever. So lots of folks, and that's interesting because let me go back to something I recently learned. Historically, I had an opportunity to go to Williamsburg, to colonial Williamsburg, where I had an opportunity to interact with some of the reenactors. And they were talking about the research that they do in order to portray these different characters. So these were people, African-American. And they were talking a lot, because I was saying, it's so interesting that you're often portraying people who worked in the houses. And I said, and they said, yeah, they said, because a lot of people come to colonial Williamsburg and they think, well, the folks who worked in the kitchen or the folks who were, ladies' maids to the mistress of the house, they had it good. And they said, but if you look at the flyers for people who were runaways and you read about who they were, many of them, the majority of them were not the folks who were in the fields. The runaways were the folks in the house because they got to see the trauma, the chaos on a daily basis, and they hated it. So they were always running, and that is not the perception that we often have. And that has often shaped a lot of the attitudes within the community. But it's not based upon an accurate portrayal of what was going on. So it's important for us to do the cross-sectional so that we have these voices from all these different perspectives where people are dealing with the oppression. That tells us a lot. Also, longitudinal, we need to take a look at what's going on. When I think about people who are dying, and I think about my grandmother who lived to be, I think, 106. And she was, it's like, did we interview her? Did we talk to her about her experiences, how she coped and how she was resilient, and what fears she has? Because that might tell me something about what I'm afraid of and why. So that's that old story of the woman who cuts the roast off on both ends and puts it in the oven. And her daughter asks her why. And she says, I'm not sure. She calls her mother. And she says, hey, mama, why cut off the roast before I put it in the oven? And the grandmother says, oh, because when I married your father, we lived in a tiny apartment with a little tiny oven. And I couldn't get that roast in the oven without cutting the ends off. So we have a lot of ways in which we cope that have been carried down, and we have reactions to situations that have been inculcated, but we don't really have the context for it. So it would be important for us to do longitudinal studies, not only to take a look at what's happening now, the snapshot now, but how am I coping 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 2 years from now? And what are my circumstances, and how am I coping? So do we change over time? Is it modified by different circumstances and different developmental challenges? So I think that would be important to understand. So I would say both, and I'm glad to hear you thinking about research and about what the next steps are, because research fuels everything. So we have flawed research, we have flawed interventions. So it's very important for us to be able to think about emancipatory research.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. West-Olatunji, it was intentional that was the last question. We want to thank you and our webinar guest for joining you and us tonight. In the next few weeks, registered participants will receive instructions on how to provide feedback on the webinar and request their 1.5 CEUs. All of this information will be sent directly to the email register with Eventbrite. AMCD members can find the recording of this webinar on the AMCD website in the next few weeks. If you have any questions, please contact Dessa Daniels at ddaniel@unm.edu.